All right, so this is day 3 of our energy systems unit. And today, what we'll be talking about is aerobic respiration. So, anaerobic was without oxygen, so aerobic is with oxygen. So, aerobic respiration, oxygen is present. There are 3 steps here. You notice this still starts with glycolysis. That's the reason why I like to start with anaerobic first, is because it is a little bit shorter, and no matter what, we're always going to start with glycolysis. And everything's the same up to that point. But now we're adding oxygen. So we go into the next part, the next step, which would be the Krebs cycle. And after that, we have the electron transport chain. Now, if you remember, the other one produced anaerobic respiration produced about 2 ATP. This one will be producing aerobic produces 34 to 38. Whenever I was in school, we just typically said 36 because that's right there in the middle. But 34 to 38 ATP is any range and any number within there is a perfectly fine number. Okay, so moving on. So glycolysis, so everything's the same up to now. Glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm. Glycolysis is the breakdown of glucose into 2 molecules of pyruvate. Again, only 2 ATP are made through glycolysis. It doesn't matter if we're talking about anaerobic or aerobic. This is where the difference comes in. If there is oxygen, pyruvate goes to the Krebs cycle, and the Krebs cycle takes place inside the mitochondria. So now we're in the cytoplasm. We have our pyruvate, oxygen is there, and it is going to bond with it. So right here, we go into the Krebs cycle. We have our pyruvate from glycolysis, and that originally came from, of course, those that 2 molecules of glucose, or the molecule of glucose. And they come through here, and it becomes this new molecule known as acetyl-CoA. I don't really ask a lot of questions about it, but you might see that term in there. It's rare to see it at this level, but you could possibly see it at this level. I do know that our dual credit college biology teacher, you will be definitely going into acetyl-CoA and more information about the different enzymes that are happening, the different reactions that are taking place here. The Krebs cycle can also be known as the citric acid cycle. Very rare, but sometimes you might see it called that. Oxygen must be present. This will occur inside the matrix of the mitochondria. Now it's important here, ATP is made and so is NADH. So if you remember back to photosynthesis, we talked about that electron carrier being NADPH. Well, now that P is for that photosynthesis, and maybe that'll help you remember that NADPH goes with photosynthesis, but NADH, there's no P there. That's what's going to go with cellular respiration. Remember, those H's are high energy electrons, and we're about to use those H's to sit there and make an abundant amount of ATP. All right? So now that we have all these NADHs, you remember how we said that the third step was the electron transport chain? Well, that's the electron that we're transporting. And we actually also down here at the bottom of glycolysis, we even made some NADH there, just not very much of it. But those electron carriers are about to take those high energy hydrogen electrons to the electron transport chain. Now, right through here at the bottom, you see where it says NADH here, the very first one? Well, this yellow line shows that it dropped off an H because if you follow this black arrow, now it's just NAD. But this H follows through, and these are proteins because this is an inner membrane inside of the mitochondria. So we're talking about proteins right here. These are protein channels that this is going through, and as this high energy electron goes through these protein channels, well, what starts to happen is eventually it runs into one, and it starts making a phosphate. And as it produces a phosphate, that phosphate gets added onto ADP. And if I take 2 and I add 1 to it, we get ATP. So that's what this whole process is about. This whole process is about trying to get these hydrogen, these stored electrons, these high energy electrons that were stored inside of a carbohydrate, and stripping them off so that we can run these. We can think of it like a turbine that's going to produce that high energy molecule. That's this phosphate, so we can stick it back on ATP and make ATP a high energy molecule again. So that, and we also have this FADH as well. It doesn't produce as much as the NADH, but it still does produce some. It like NADH is an electron carrier. It just doesn't produce as much energy. Also, if you notice, I say right here, oxygen is the final acceptor of hydrogen. So let's think about it. We have all this hydrogen, and then you're supposed to be breathing during all of this. And whenever you're breathing in, you're taking in oxygen. Well, if I take hydrogen, 2 hydrogens, and I add it to 1 oxygen, well, I end up with H2O. So if you can remember back to the formula for cellular respiration, the products of what was produced was carbon dioxide. Well, we already produced that. That came off earlier. That already came out. ATP, which is produced down here at the bottom here, and we also produce some in glycolysis and a little bit in Krebs. But there's also water that's supposed to be produced, and that's what's produced right here, is that water. Okay? So this is the slide I was talking about on day 2, where it compares and you actually get to see the difference between the two systems side by side. You will need to know this slide. This slide can really help you understand the difference here. Aerobic, oxygen is required. Anaerobic, not required. Aerobic, look at that amount of ATP versus anaerobic. The steps that are involved, glycolysis, Krebs, and the ETC. Whereas there's really only one step with anaerobic. You could argue that fermentation is a step, but I really don't, because that's just the result of the fact there's no oxygen, so it causes the pyruvate must ferment. Typically, whenever we talk about cellular respiration, we're implying anaerobic because respiration implies breathing, taking in oxygen. Aerobic respiration is going to occur in the cytoplasm and the mitochondria. The cytoplasm would be that glycolysis part. The mitochondria would be the Krebs and the ETC, while the anaerobic, it only occurs in the cytoplasm. This is also the way that bacteria, they're able to make their energy. Because if you remember, bacteria, they don't have a mitochondria. They don't have that. But they do have cytoplasm. So bacteria are anaerobic organisms, so they can only ferment. Hence the reason why they produce alcohol and their primary uses for that, as far as what we use them for in that industry, is because that's what they produce. Here's a diagram to kind of show it happening a little bit more. So I'm going to kind of go through this and see if you can follow me. I'll be starting on the left side where it says glucose. So glucose, of course, right here in the red box, it says that we're in the cytoplasm. So whenever you have glucose, oh, sorry, I hit the mouse pad. Whenever you have glucose in the cytoplasm, it's already being worked on to be broken apart. So we've entered the cell. It's already been worked on to be broken apart through glycolysis. Now, if oxygen is available, it's able to go and be carried into the mitochondria. And of course, this is that CO2 that was produced during that Krebs cycle and that process of it coming inside. This is that CO2 that's produced. And of course, it goes into the Krebs cycle. Krebs cycle is going to be making it's going to be making a little bit of ATP, not a lot, and it's also going to be making a whole bunch of that NADH and FADH. And all of those electrons to that process is taken to the ETC, where we have a whole bunch of ATP being made, and of course water. So you will see some questions that deal with an image like this. So let's say I gave you an image similar to this, but I took out the word glycolysis and put a question mark there and asked you basically, well, what's happening there? So if we have glucose, and then I see this arrow coming over here to acetyl-CoA, well, I have to know that glucose has to first go through glycolysis. Now, if oxygen's not available, fermentation happens. If oxygen is available, heck, we're going into cellular respiration. We're going to be aerobic. Or I might put a question mark here where it says Krebs cycle. Now, the great thing is that it looks like a cycle, like a wheel going around, so it should be easy to get. In the past, some students have made the mistake of getting Krebs cycle from cellular respiration confused with the Calvin cycle from photosynthesis. So really make sure you take a look at that because I don't want you to make just that simple mistake. Okay. So here's some review questions for you. Where does cellular respiration take place? What's the chemical equation for cellular respiration? You know, products and reactants. This is all the same as before. What happens to the electrons during cellular respiration? They all get taken to the electron transport chain so that we can sit there and make ATP. How much ATP is produced? 34 to 38. What's the difference between aerobic and anaerobic energy processes? Please look back at that slide to make sure that you can answer that and go through the differences. Okay? You'll have a lot of questions that deal with this based on and how you would answer it is you would need to know the difference so that you would know which one to more accurately mark. So next class, what we're going to do is we're actually going to link photosynthesis and cellular respiration together and show that how that's a process that depends upon each other. That'll be really short, and so we're also going to do our Unit 5 test review as well. All right. Please don't forget you have your work that you can do. That's your quiz is. You also have these videos that you can go back and look at if you're confused by it. And if you have any questions, just email me. Thanks.